You've come to the right spot. It's another edition of Lewis at Large. 60 minutes of smart talk radio is in your future, with guests from all walks of life and all points of view. And now, with this week's edition of Lewis at Large, here's your host, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means, of course, that some smart talk radio is in your future. And this segment, certainly one that we've been looking forward to. We're going to be talking with Marilyn K. Roach. She is a historian. She's also an illustrator. Her work has been featured in the Boston Globe. She's lectured to groups around the country. She's the author of the classic The Salem Witch Trials, a day-by-day chronicle of a community under siege, a new work called Six Women of Salem, the untold story of the accused and their accusers in the Salem Witch Trials. Marilyn, how are you, my friend?
Fine, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
You bet. We have not talked ever on the many years on this show about the Salem Witch Trials. What I would like to do, if we could, for our listeners is give us specific. We've all heard about it. There've been some made-for-TV movies, some other things, but give us why Salem, Massachusetts, and why witch trials. Tell us how that all set us up for it.
People didn't go around accusing their neighbors every day, of course. Things really got out of hand in 1692. It was, as somebody put it, a perfect storm of bad things happening all at once, each one which seemed to prove that there was something awful happening that was causing all this. I think it was a lot of simmering neighborhood suspicions and resentments that combined with the general tensions of the time because, for one thing, there was a war on. Canada was part of France at that time, and King Louis wanted to expand his New World possessions, so there were frontier raids out of French Canada periodically at this time. People would be kidnapped if they weren't killed and taken back to Canada. The economy suffered because of this, obviously. There was smallpox in the area every so often, and there was no antidote to that then, so it was a fearsome thing to think about. Let's see, and Massachusetts had lost the charter that made its government legal when England got rid of the charters of all of the English possessions at the restoration of the monarchy over in England, but Massachusetts tended to be a bit more too independent-minded, so it took them longer to get a new one that could be accepted. And they only received that in 1692, and had to rewrite the laws of Massachusetts to match England's laws. And for a while, they didn't know what England had in mind for them. It was a certain vacuum of uncertainty that let old resentments simmer and boil up. There were local problems, say in Salem Village, which is the rural part of Salem itself, about whether they should break off to be a town on their own, which they eventually did, but not for a couple of generations. Whether they should keep the minister some of them had hired, whether he should be their permanent one or not. Somebody had promised him the parsonage, and others thought that he shouldn't have it, even after they'd promised it. So there was a whole lot of not getting along, so that when certain girls in the household of the minister, his daughter and niece, began acting oddly that winter, they seemed, I don't know what ailed them. I haven't come up with any one answer, but they tried home remedies, they tried praying with them, they tried getting the local doctors in, medical doctors. And one of them said, well, maybe they're under an evil hand, which meant someone had cast a spell on them. And once that suspicion had been voiced, people began to wonder who else might be out there having evil, magical thoughts against them. And the first people who were accused, one of whom is one of the six in the book, Tituba, the slave in the household. She's more or less badgered into confessing to save her skin, and she says there are other witches out there, and people began to wonder who else. One of my neighbors, somebody I know who I never liked, who else is out there? And people began to make other accusations. Of the 6 women in the title, 5 of them were accused, and 3 of them were accusers, some accused and accused in one person. So it escalated as the jails filled up, and there was no superior court to have an actual witch trial, which is being a capital case, would have to go to the higher court, until later in the summer when the government started to be restructured. But Salem is, although the fire, in effect, started in Salem, it's most associated with the trials because it was the county seat. So when there were trials, the judges came to Salem to handle them.
Marilyn, sorry to interrupt you. I'm just curious though, why weren't there also the Richmond trials or Philadelphia trials or Hanover, New Hampshire trials? Right.
I hate to admit it, but most of the witch trials in early America did take place in New England. There were a couple of large outbreaks of this sort of panic in Connecticut, I have to say, before Salem. And in 1692 also, and a number of neighbors thought things had been happening, but that didn't lead to anybody being executed because the magistrates at that point were paying attention to the misery being caused in Massachusetts. But I guess because they were more willing to prosecute, that it seemed more real that it would happen to them. The devil had it in for New England because they were trying to be on God's side at all times.
Right.
So,
but
that would cause some problems there.
Just in general, and again, the work focuses specifically on 6 women, but overall, these dozens of women that over time that were put on trial, what did they have in common, or were they truly random and picked out by just a hysterical community?
Well, about a quarter of those in the Salem outbreak were men, actually, and of those who were actually executed. Problems with the neighbors, I would say. Some of them were quite quarrelsome characters, or they may have had reason to be quarrelsome with their neighbors, depending on the neighbor. Pre-existing personality problems, the way people rubbed each other the wrong way, and eventually it just boiled up. Although during the 1692 outbreak, there were people accused who wouldn't ordinarily have been accused, like the richest woman in Salem, Mary English. And Rebecca Nurse, who's one of the 6 here, was a respectable woman with a large supportive family. They spoke up for her during the trials even and got 250 neighbors or so to sign a petition on her behalf. She was a full member of the Salem Church, but one of the neighbors, Ann Putnam Sr., really didn't like her. I don't know why, but she seemed to be the prime person who just did not trust Rebecca Nurse and had it in for her one way or the other.
If you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. We're talking to Marilyn K. Roach, a lifelong resident of Watertown, Massachusetts. But for this discussion, she is also an independent scholar, a historian, and illustrator. We're talking about a work, a pretty specific work called The 6 Women of Salem, the untold story of the accused and their accusers in the Salem witch trials. Marilyn, this is a really unique sort of glitch in American history. The idea that people were rounded up based on this, put on trial fairly or unfairly, and yet, as I referenced earlier, is there evidence that anything similar to this happened anywhere else in the country? What's always intrigued me about this is sort of the reason why it was there, the reason why it happened, why it was allowed to happen, and interesting that it never cropped up, to my knowledge anyway, anywhere else in the country.
Well, it was an unusual outbreak. There had been a number of suspects at one time tried in Connecticut some decades earlier, which was also unusual. But apparently the magistrates were more willing to take it seriously than in other parts of the country, which is not to say that there wasn't folk beliefs that this could be going on. I do know that there were perhaps, vigilante movements against suspects in other places. During the 1780s, when the Constitution of the United States was being written in Philadelphia, at that very time, while they're hashing out our nation's laws, there was a mob action in the street against a woman that some people suspected of having bewitched a child, and they roughed her up enough so that she died a few days later, which was not in New England.
Well, let me ask you this specifically. We talk about the accusations of someone of being a witch. Describe for us, if you would, what the definition by that community standards, I guess, was a witch. Are there varying degrees of witchdom? And therefore, if you were a witch, why it was necessarily a crime? Maybe it's obvious, but why it was a crime. And pick, for example, one of these women and take us through their story from before the accusations all the way through the trial, etc.
Well, let's see, Bridget Bishop, let's say. Well, what the law said about witches was somebody with a familiar spirit, by which they meant an imp or devil who was doing the magic for them. But the inference was that they had deliberately allied themselves with the devil to go against everything good, overthrow anything that God's people wanted, and generally wreak havoc, which she had not done, of course. None of them had done it. It was things that was suspected, and it was still, that kind of law was still on the books in England for a long time after. Let's see, people had suspected Bridget before. I'm not sure why. Personality differences, I guess. She had been accused a couple of decades earlier and arrested, and there was a hearing. There are some notes left from the previous episode, but she's released. Apparently the case is dismissed for lack of evidence. Apparently her spirit, had been seen doing some mischief, tormenting somebody, stealing eggs from the neighbor's barn, that sort of thing. So they dismissed that one. But again, in 1692, she's suspected again because I imagine a number of people thought, well, maybe it was right the first time. And I think in her case, which is unusual, her reputation perhaps got mixed up with another woman who was also innocent. But her name was Bishop. Her last name was Bishop, although she was no relation. And in fact, their trial papers had been misfiled together, so that they've only been sorted out in the 20th century as to who did what or didn't do what. So she's arrested. Someone swears out a complaint against her for torturing, supposedly, the afflicted girls. She's arrested, and though she lives in town in Salem, she's taken to Salem Village, where her victims supposedly are, and is questioned there by the Salem magistrates. This is the hearing. This is where all the notes and dialogue is preserved from, which is very convenient. But it's the hearing. It goes to the point where they decide that there's enough of suspicion here to hold her for trial. So she's held in jail in Salem at first for trial. And ordinarily, people weren't kept in jail for long periods, just until the next quarterly court sitting, if necessary, or out on bail, though not for something that's supposedly a potentially murderous supposed crime. In fact, she was taken to the Boston jail because it was assumed that all of the trials would be there, as had been the case before under the old charter, but so many people in Essex County, which is where they were accused that a temporary court was formed to legally handle the cases, and she's sent back to Salem. The judges go up to Salem, and she, in fact, is the first to be tried. She goes before a grand jury, and they consider the notes from the hearing and statements from her supposed victims, people whose children had died, they blamed her for that. People whose beer had spoiled, that sort of thing. And they figured that there is enough here to present her case to a trial jury. This all happened on one day, apparently. And so she goes before the trial jury, and they find her guilty as charged. And the head judge issues an execution warrant. She's condemned to be hanged, which she is, and she's the first to be hanged that summer, unfortunately. But there was due process. It's just that they really weren't looking at the evidence closely enough.
Marilyn, were there many of these people undoubtedly were probably literally pulled out of their homes, having no idea that something like this would happen. Were there, on the other hand, women, or men, I suppose, for that matter, that openly claimed to be a witch or embraced all of this and knew that this could be a consequence, but they did it anyway?
No, I don't find any evidence of that. There was a lot of folk magic that people did, which they thought was harmless, and other people thought would perhaps attract evil spirits. But no, they didn't consider themselves witches.
What, because you've done so much research into this, I'm curious as to, do you view this as sort of a historical novelty and sort of interesting in American history? Is this something of awful shame? Is this something what do we sort of learn from all of this? And ultimately, why did it stop? Why did the trial stop?
Well, it got so big a problem with so many people being accused and the jails so full that finally, the other voices, people who were defending their relatives and casting doubt on veracity of the evidence, that side was listened to. September was a particularly awful month, and October, which is Halloween month now in Salem, was quieted down. They suspended the trials for the time being until England could give them advice as to what to do, which they finally had to start trials again the next winter just to clear the jails. But at that time, they no longer accepted spectral evidence, which was two supposedly afflicted people seeing the spirits after them, corroborating each other, because as they had been reminded from the start by people who had been accused, the devil can counterfeit that sort of thing. So why are you believing it without doubt? And that changed the gist of things, because only shouldn't have been that many. Only 3 were found guilty the following winter, and they didn't hang. They lived to tell the tale. And in Massachusetts, too little, too late, but Massachusetts did apologize for it in 1697, that they had really gone wrong with it. And in 1711, due to petitions from the survivors or the families of those who didn't survive, the names of the condemned were cleared by a reversal of attainder, or at least the names of those who petitioned. And monetary restitution was made to some extent to people for jail bills and lost income, that sort of thing.
What about, obviously, the whole issue of civil liberties comes into play here so much. It's always been fascinating to me. Is there any evidence to suggest that trials such as this were also going on in one form or another in Europe?
There had been far more witch trials in Europe, but mostly before this. There were perhaps a few afterwards. And there had been a big upswing in witch trials in England in the 1640s, not too long before this happened. And an outbreak in Sweden that they reference as an example at the time, before 1692, which sort of served as an example of what witches might do, because they believed that something had been happening then. Afterwards, of course, people changed their minds. But the trials here in Massachusetts became such an awful example of what could go wrong, so that people realized the law and the accusers had in fact done what they knew, what to them the devil would like them to do, is to make everything go wrong for their neighbors instead of Christian charity and all that idea. It was so bad that that's what stopped it from ever happening again. Of course, people can be suspected of other things that they may or may not have done, but at least there were no more witch accusations.
Again, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis, here on Lewis at Large. We're in the middle of some Smart Talk Radio with Marilyn K. Roach, a historian and illustrator. The specific work is Six Women of Salem, the untold story of the accused and their accusers in the Salem witch trials. Marilyn, as a result, are there currently laws on the books in Massachusetts or any other place specifically referring to the whole concept of accusing people of being witches? Either that practice is now outlawed, or are there some old laws that maybe narrow the definition of what a witch is?
Well, as I said, Massachusetts was rewriting its laws at that time, and they wrote one that wasn't as severe, because if somebody was doing magic for fortune-telling, or maybe they killed a cow, it wouldn't be as much of a penalty as if they killed the neighbor. And that all of these laws were submitted to England's Privy Council for approval, and they wouldn't allow this one on a technicality because there wasn't British oversight on something. But they didn't disagree that there could be a problem with witches. But rather than rewrite it to the Privy Council's approval, Massachusetts just ignored it, and we have been unprotected by any anti-witchcraft laws, and we have not suffered at all because of it.
What, again, is there such a thing now in the state, descendants of these people? They undoubtedly they have some unique things in common. Are there still groups around that sort of, number one, keep that memory alive and sort of, as they say, at least we ever forget type thing? Tell us about that.
Yes, there's a lot of descendants. Rebecca Nurse's family was vocal from beginning to end that they weren't going to let their grandmother's memory be besmirched at all. And let's see, in the 1880s, at a family reunion, they all got together and commissioned a monument in her honor, which is in the family burying ground. And this is presumably the first memorial for someone who had been accused and executed unfairly, of course. There's a lot of descendants. Now, I mean, for a while people didn't want to talk about this sort of thing, a lot of them, and others would not let the matter drop because they knew their ancestors were innocent, and that way a number of stories got preserved, fortunately. But as far as genealogy goes, finding an accused witch is rather a plum discovery now.
Well, it is a fascinating story. It's one that sort of seems to kind of pop up here and there. We know it's taught in American history, the depth. I can't speak to that. Maybe, Marilyn, do you have a comment about that? Are American kids being taught enough about it? Do they know the story?
Well, there's a lot of misconceptions about it. It wasn't something that happened every day in colonial America or colonial Massachusetts. That nobody was burned. People were hanged, which is not so great, but nobody was burned for it. And they did apologize afterwards and try to make restitution. That is, the state did. So it's touched on briefly, but not always accurately. It could be. They should be remembered, the people who were hanged, as being brave, because they didn't admit to something they hadn't done, for the most part, and they didn't. Most of them did not accuse other people, which might have at least delayed their trials. So they're brave people, and there were a lot of people defending them. That part gets forgotten. The people who signed petitions and people who made statements. It didn't save the lives of my 6 and the 19 who were hanged.
Right.
But they did speak up, and finally that voice prevailed.
Well, again, we have been speaking this segment with Marilyn K. Roach. She is a historian and an author, obviously. The new work, Six Women of Salem, a very in-depth story, the untold story, the accused and their accusers in the Salem witch trials. It is published by Da Capo Press. Marilyn, how can people find out more about this subject and also get a copy of the book?
Well, if it's not in your local bookstore, it is on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And it's a very good website that has all sorts of background information. Oh, mercies. Okay, I think it was SalemWitchTrials.org. It's the University of Virginia.
Okay.
Sponsors this. So if you find that website, you have access to some of the original documents and a lot of background material.
Well, listen, thank you so much for your time and your insight, and certainly appreciate it.
Thank you.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.